All right, we start with the United States, where President Joe Biden has delivered his first foreign policy speech more than 2 weeks after taking office. In the wide-ranging address, he touched on Yemen, Russia, China and Myanmar. Now, CGTN's Owen Fairclough reports.
Diplomacy is back, the words of new US President Joe Biden in his first major foreign policy address, setting out his ambitions for his new administration. And this was very much about breaking with the Trump administration's policy. For example, former President Donald Trump wanted closer relations with Saudi Arabia. Biden has announced that the US will withdraw its support for the Saudi-led coalition fighting Houthi rebels backed by Iran in Yemen. And where the Trump administration was characterized by threatening to withdraw from multilateral institutions and turning its back on some allies, Biden wants to embrace them in a new era of international cooperation.
Over the past 2 weeks, I've spoken with the leaders of many of our closest friends: Canada, Mexico, the UK, Germany, France, NATO, Japan, South Korea, Australia, to being reforming the habits of cooperation and rebuilding the muscle of democratic alliances that have atrophied over the past few years of neglect and, I would argue, abuse.
But there are limits to this cooperation. While Washington and Moscow have extended their treaty curbing their most destructive long-range nuclear missiles, Biden has said that he will confront Russia over its attempts to rig multiple elections here in the United States and beyond. And China has been described by Biden's administration as the single most important relationship, a relationship that deteriorated badly under the Trump administration with a trade war that was largely destructive to US businesses. Biden says he wants to change the tone of this relationship, even if the substance may remain the same, with Trump-era tariffs on Chinese imports into the United States remaining in place for now.
We'll also take on directly the challenges posed by our prosperity, security, and democratic values by our most serious competitor, China. But we are ready to work with Beijing when it's in America's interest to do so.
Many of these foreign policy themes are familiar for any US administration, but the situation in Myanmar does pose a major test for Biden, with the military takeover of the democratically elected government there led by Aung San Suu Kyi. Many Western allies and the United Nations are now discussing the reimposition of sanctions amid calls for the military to release Aung San Suu Kyi from detention. And while Biden has joined in those calls, he stopped short in this speech of declaring sanctions on Myanmar for now. Owen Fairclough, CGTN, Washington.
Now, for more on the speech, we go live to our reporters Dong Xue in Beijing and Jack Barton in Hongchang, South Korea. I'll start with you, Dong Xue. Biden said the U.S. will work with China when it's America's interests, as he called Beijing the most serious competitor for Washington. Any response from China?
Well, Donnie, the U.S. President Joe Biden spent much of his speech promising to reverse the policies of his predecessor. He focused on the needs to cooperate with other countries on the pandemic, climate change, and other global issues. Well, on China, Biden said his administration is ready to work with Beijing when, I quote, "it is in America's interest to do so." He said China is America's main competitor and a challenge to the U.S. across many key areas. Well, this is a position echoed by some of Biden's top diplomat picks, for instance, Anthony Blinken as Secretary of State and Linda Thomas-Greenfield as Ambassador to the United Nations. Well, Beijing is expected to respond later in the day, probably through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but top Chinese diplomats have recently made their voices heard. Well, on Tuesday, senior diplomat Yang Jiechi said China is ready to work with the U.S. to move the relationship forward. He called for a path of, quote, "no conflict, no confrontation, mutual respect, and win-win cooperation." Well, last month, China's ambassador to the U.S. made similar remarks at a virtual forum on China-U.S. ties. He called for a return to dialogue and warned against Washington treating Beijing like a strategic rival. He said this would be a huge strategic misjudgment. But few analysts believe getting things back to normal is going to be easy. Beijing recently warned Washington against crossing its red lines on Taiwan, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and Tibet. And there are still serious trade and technology differences that need to be settled. Dongning.
Indeed, thank you very much, Dong Xue, reporting from Beijing. Now, Jack, Biden said under his leadership, the U.S. will stand shoulder to shoulder with its allies and key partners once more. South Korea is among the U.S. Closest friends in Asia, of course. So how has Seoul reacted to that?
Well, again, we're still waiting for a full reaction from Seoul, perhaps later on today. There was a talk over the phone by Joe Biden and President Moon Jae-in, though, before this speech went ahead, in which Biden reportedly reassured President Moon that the U.S. was reviewing its strategy on the DPRK and denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula, that the U.S. was still committed to that process, and also that there needed to be a comprehensive strategy to achieve that goal. But if we listen to the speech by President Biden outlining his foreign policy objectives, he says diplomacy is at the center of that, but one thing that's clearly not at the center is the DPRK and the denuclearization process, because there was no mention at all in that speech of those things. Very different to President Trump, who along with Iran really put the DPRK as one of the big ticket lists in his foreign policy list. So yeah, this is something very different. You'd have to wonder how this is being received in Pyongyang, and of course also here in Seoul at the Presidential Blue House, the fact that there was no mention at all. Another issue though in the speech that South Korea will be very keen to get more details on is the realignment of troops and assets with diplomatic objectives. We heard about the drawdown in Yemen, about the freeze on the drawdown in Germany. Well, there's 28,500 US troops here. Trump had been pushing for a 50% increase of cost sharing with South Korea. He'd been threatening to draw those troop numbers down. And of course, South Korea is still wondering what's going on with that process. We heard before Biden's speech from Lloyd Austin, the US Secretary of Defense, saying he wants to wrap up that as quickly as possible, those negotiations. Certainly here that will be seen as a hopeful sign that perhaps they're going to take South Korea's more modest offer of cost sharing and keep the level of troops as they are. But still, when it comes to South Korea and the issue of denuclearization on the peninsula in general, still more question marks than answers.
All right. Thank you very much. Jack Barton reporting from Hongchang in South Korea. Well, Joe Biden underlined the messages that America is back and diplomacy is back at the center, as he outlined some of his foreign policy priorities. He named a few of Washington's most trusted allies, vowing to work closely with them. He announced an end to U.S. support for the Saudi-led military offensive in Yemen. Biden also described Russia as a threat to U.S. democracy, while he called China America's most serious competitor. He also touched upon the recent political turmoil in Myanmar, urging the military to relinquish power. And on refugee policy, he's raised the admissions cap to 125,000 people for this first full fiscal year. Now, Biden also committed to reinvigorating what he called America's moral leadership on the LGBTQI issues. But in his wide-ranging address, Biden did not detail his plans on the Iran nuclear issue, Afghanistan, Israel-Palestine relations, or the DPRK. All right, now let's bring in our two guests, Mr. Yang Xiyu, joining us in the studio. He's a senior fellow at the China Institute of International Studies, and also Mr. Joseph Gregory Mahoney joins us from Memphis, Tennessee. He's a professor of politics at East China Normal University. Pleasure to have you both, gentlemen. First of all, Mr. Yang, Biden says diplomacy is back at the center. America is back in general. Back to what, apart from diplomacy mentioned in his speech? The world leadership, or economy, anything?
Well, it seems to me that the American back means the traditional American foreign policy returns, which had before Trump era be characterized by two phrases: leadership and partnership. That means American dominance on everything supported by his vast allied states. But for China, that means two levels of American foreign policy. One is the American value, the other is alliances. Alliances based on American value will forge, for China, will forge the so-called unified front against China on all aspects: securities, markets, and the regimes. So basically, the American returns means the traditional policy returns.
All right, and then what should the world make of this?
Well, you know, there's just like things say there are always two sides on everything. Such a returning of traditional policies really provide two different things. On one hand, I think China will meet more sophisticated and more complicated challenges than Trump era. But on the other hand, just because the traditional policy returns, the more predictable, more seeable, more stable policy than Trump returns. So both opportunities and challenges for China. But for China, we will focus on the opportunities to expand with our greatest efforts to expand the ground for corporations and contain the ground on where the confrontations will be.
Right, and Professor Mahoney, Biden is aiming to rebuild ties with U.S. allies. Can he return relations back to where they were before Trump?
Well, I think it's fair to say that there are many around the world, especially allies, who are eager to see the U.S. play a more engaged and effective leadership role globally, but with less aggression, more diplomacy, and more multilateralism. Now, I think what we have seen so far from Biden in terms of what he's called for and in terms of his actions, like rejoining the WHO, the Paris Accord, the Paris Agreement, is that we've seen this return to a principles-based pragmatism, while at the same time realizing that the world has changed irrevocably, that it faces several existential crises, including COVID-19 and climate change, which he noted, and that it requires more cooperation with not only allies but also competitors and adversaries.
Right, and talking about competitors and adversaries, Biden called China the most serious competitor. How is that different from a rival or an adversary?
Well, this typology appears to be emerging in official and think tank discourse in Washington. But to be fair, it remains fuzzy at this point. In his speech, he appeared to refer to Russia as more of an adversary, if we read it closely, which is a negative term, and China as a competitor, which is more of a neutral term. This distinction seems consistent with earlier remarks made during the campaign. I think it's an opening for discussion. I'm going to be optimistic and say it's much better to be called a competitor than an adversary.
So I think it's a good sign, or at least a goodwill sign. Professor Yang, the White House would work with China, as Biden said in his speech, when it's in America's best interest, so it's conditional. The question is, do we have enough overlap to meet the aims of both countries?
Well, the answer would be very complicated. The subject thing is, what U.S. wants to cooperate with China is not always what China wants in. So basically, the so-called cooperation should be based on the mutual consulted, mutually shared interests. But in most cases, I believe the common ground or the overlapping ground for cooperation really contain great potentials. For example, President Biden set the 4 top priority tasks: pandemic, economy, racial problems, and climate changes. Except the racial problem, the other 3 are really needed the international cooperation, especially cooperation with China. And China has been ready for cooperation, full cooperation on all of the three areas: pandemic, economy, and climate change. Remember, U.S. and China really have good experiences on the cooperation on the climate change and the economy. In 2008, when financial crisis broke out, China and the U.S. Made a good cooperation and upgrade the mechanism of the G20 summit. And in the climate change, President Xi Jinping and President Obama made great efforts, made a great cooperation to pass for the passage of the Paris Agreement. So based on the past experiences and based on the existing shared interests, I think the cooperation are really doable.
There are good examples of bilateral relations, but from Biden's speech, we can see signs of goodwill, signs of willingness to work with China, but on the other hand, we also see a lot of harsh words on China as well. Quite obvious attempt to contain China. So on one hand, working with China, on the other hand, containing China. How do that work?
Well, I think China, as a former diplomat, frankly speaking, China has been used to facing the two-faceted American policy against China. We call it as two hands on two hands by American. So for China, we have to do the similar thing, two hands on two hands. If U.S. want to cooperate, cooperation, yes, we fully, sincerely cooperate with U.S. But if U.S. want to confront with China and China oppose that and also ready to deal with the confrontation, but basically, I'm not pessimistic about the U.S.-China relation, except the case of Taiwan.
Right. So the bottom line is Taiwan. Professor Mahoney, the Biden administration says it will review tariffs on China rather than repealing them. Would working to resolve trade tensions be in Washington's best interest?
You know, Biden can't afford politically to appear soft on China right now. He still has to get members of his cabinet confirmed. He has other domestic priorities. And there are people on both sides of the aisle in the Senate and in the House who are hawks on China. So he's going to go slow. And I think that what we're going to see is that he's already figured out that it's going to be tactically prudent to buy time with a review and then possibly use any potential unwinding of tariffs as leverage in new negotiations with Beijing.
Well, as what you said, that willingness is a good thing, but what matters is the action, so we need to wait and see. Thank you very much. Professor Yang Xiyu, Senior Fellow at the China Institute of International Studies, and Professor Joseph Gregory Mahoney, Professor of Politics at East China Normal University. Thank you very much for your insights, gentlemen.